introduce Will Miller, our speaker this evening, but I've got a little bit on the long side of an introduction compared to what I normally do, so I thought I would go ahead and begin because particularly for our first-year students who in some cases may not have been down to Columbus yet, I thought it would be useful for you to hear a shamelessly brief introduction to Columbus. I'll also tell you that next week our lecturer is Art Shaler, a former teacher here. Art is now the director of the program at Norwich in Vermont, and Art will be talking about, I forget the title, although it's a catchy title, I forget what it is, but he'll be here next week at the same time. This evening, however, Will Miller is here to talk about the work of the Saarinen in Columbus, and for the benefit of our freshmen who may not have visited Columbus yet, nor know its legacy, I thought it would be useful to say a few words about it. Columbus, Indiana is a city of around 39,000 people. It's located in the center of a triangle that's formed by Indy, Louisville, and Cincinnati, and it would be just another small Midwestern town except for the vision and cooperation of people who wanted to make Columbus the best community they could create. The public and private partnerships and corporate pride have earned Columbus national recognition. I'm going to tell you more about and why this is a special place in this sort of shamelessly abbreviated history that I hope will help you. When Bartholomew County was founded in 1821 at the site of the confluence of the Driftwood and Flat Rock rivers, Columbus was selected as the county seat. The economy was based on farming and milling. The rivers were used to transport goods until the state's first railroad reached Columbus in 1844. Although faced with economic decline in the early 1900s, the economy turned around with the establishment of new businesses in Columbus, including Cummins Engine Company, now Cummins Inc., in 1919, and Arvin Industries, now Arvin Mentor, which was founded in 1925. Modern Columbus is defined by a series of events that began in 1942, when the first Christian church dedicated its new building. Designed by the Finnish architect Ewing Miller as a break with traditional Romanesque and Gothic structures, the building heralded the beginning of modern architecture in Columbus. Thereafter, J. Irwin Miller, who died last year, transformed Columbus, Indiana into a modern design capital. J. Irwin is Will's father. Miller led the Cummins Engine Company to international prominence as a maker of diesel engines and power equipment. In 1954, he started a foundation to subsidize architecture in his hometown of Columbus. It has since paid around $13.7 or $14 million in design fees for 42 projects, and this is extraordinary leverage given the reputation it now has. Those projects have been done by firms including Skidmore, Owings & Merrill's, Newton Newspaper Building, an IMP Library, a Kevin Roach Post Office, and a Cesar Pelli Shopping Center. Miller's home, designed by Eero was designated a National Historic Landmark in 2001. And it's, I think, also notable that Columbus has enjoyed immense contributions from landscape architects as well, notably Dan Kiley, the landscape architect for Miller's home, and more recently Michael van Valkenburg in the Mill Race Park in 1992. Returning to our history, the next step towards modern architecture occurred in 1954 with the construction of the Irwin Union Bank, designed by Eero with the construction of Schmidt Elementary School in 1957, and in support of the concept that the built environment is crucial to a quality community, the Cummins Engine Foundation offered to pay the architect's fees for any new school that was designed by an architect by the to include a variety of public buildings. Other companies and church congregations also decided to seek architects who would add to the community's quality of design. Saarinen, Harry Weiss ranked Columbus 6th in a list that included Chicago, New York, San Francisco, Boston, and Washington, D.C. for academic innovation and design. Good community. By one which provides the good things for all its residents: schools, parks, churches, civics buildings, programs that meet community needs, and events that entertain. When you visit, it's easy to see that living in Columbus means caring about making the community a better place to live. There's a commitment to making the best of the old and build for the future in a quality way that everyone considers worth saving. Columbus has, as I mentioned, earned worldwide recognitions for its modern architecture. That survey of AIA members and 829 members ranked Columbus 6th, as I mentioned. And this legacy of the Cummins Foundation is a powerful one, and it's now in the hands of Will Miller, our speaker today. Will graduated cum laude from Yale University with a BA in English. He received his MBA degree from Stanford University, graduating as an R.J. Miller Scholar. Early in his career, he worked as a manager on the assembly line at Cummins Engine Company in South Carolina. Today, Will Miller is chairman and CEO of Irwin Financial Corporation, an interrelated group of specialized financial service companies serving consumers and small businesses in the United States and Canada. Irwin Financial consists of 4 major operating companies: Irwin Mortgage Corporation, Irwin Union Bank and Trust Company, Irwin Home Equity Corporation, and Irwin Commercial Finance. The company is traded on the New York Stock Exchange, and Irwin Financial has net revenues in 2004 of $525 million. Will became chairman of Irwin Financial in 1990 after serving on Irwin Financial's board of directors since 1985. Prior to 1990, he was president of Irwin Management Company in Columbus, a family investment management firm which is now affiliated with Irwin Financial. He also serves as chairman of the board of Tipton Lakes Company, a real estate development firm. He serves on the boards of directors of Cummins, Inc., New Perspective Fund, Euro-Pacific Growth Fund, New World Fund, Irwin Management Company, and Tipton Lakes Company. Nonprofit boards on which he serves include the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation in Chicago, the National Building Museum in Washington, D.C., the Cummins Foundation, the Central Indiana Corporate Partnership, Irwin Sweeney Miller Foundation, Irwin Financial Foundation, and the Heritage Fund of Bartholomew County, a community foundation. He's a fellow of the Yale Corporation, the governing body of Yale University, and a member of the Yale University Investment Committee. And the lecture that he's going to be delivering today, he delivered earlier this year at Yale University, or in part. Would you please join me in welcoming Will Miller?
Can everybody hear in the back? Great. Well, I'm going to tell you a bit about the 4 buildings that were designed by either Elio or Eero Saarinen in Columbus, Indiana. It's a pleasure to be in a place where I don't have to explain that Columbus is in Indiana. You usually have to do that. But to start with, the first Christian church, which at the time was called the Tabernacle Christian Church, was a important congregation in our community in the 1930s that was the senior minister of which was my grandfather, Z.T. Sweeney. They were in a traditional Gothic style church a block north of where this building is today. And in about 1938 went out and interviewed architects to build a new, larger facility for the growing congregation, and settled on a Boston-based architect who began the design process, developed a fairly standard Gothic style church, and then had a nervous breakdown and resigned the commission, causing them in about 1938 to have to start the process all over again. According to the legend, my grandmother, Nettie Sweeney Miller, was on the newly reformed building committee, and they went around the country interviewing architects, and this time they thought they would try to go for the best. They'd had this relationship with a person who turned out to be a somewhat unreliable architect, and so they thought they would try to find one of the best architects in the country. In the end, they settled on Frank Lloyd Wright and Elio Saarinen, Elio being, of course, at Cranbrook, having come over from Finland to start George Booth's art school. And just a few years prior to that, 1936, Eero had joined the firm and become a partner with his father. And so Eero Saarinen, although a young man in his 20s, was increasingly had an important leading role in the firm. Again, legend has it that they went and visited Frank Lloyd Wright, found him to be living in sin, and decided not to hire him, it being a church. And they settled on Saarinen, although I think one of the interesting things that does say a lot about my grandmother is she is reported to have said, "Mr. Saarinen will probably design a church I will not like, but it will be a great building and we should hire him." However, Saarinen turned the commission down. He wasn't particularly interested in building churches. As he said at that time, they seemed to be more for the glory of the congregation than the glory of God. It might help you all to remember that Elio was the son of a Lutheran minister in Finland. So he had very strong views on this. It was at that point that my father, who was 29 years old, asked the building committee for permission to attempt to convince Aeliel Saarinen to take this job. So in April of 1939, he traveled up to Cranbrook, and he did not meet Eero on this visit, by the way. One of the great myths that's grown up around the relationship of my father and Eero is that they met at Yale. They did not. They met only when Eero was down working on this building in 1939. But he did sit with Aeliel in that incredible octagonal dining room in the Cranbrook President's House, and around that table tried to talk him into accepting the assignment. According to Dad, he thinks the argument that got him to take it was, Dad said, this particular congregation was seeking to live a rich inner life and a simple outer life. And that concept was sufficiently intriguing to Saarinen to accept the commission. At the time this building was completed, it was a very radical building. It was one of the first modernist churches in America. Time magazine said, when are they going to move the factory machines in? Because to them it just looked like a factory, not like a church. It is, however, an incredibly subtle building. I've often said that I think in a lot of ways this building illustrates Saarinen's roots in the arts and crafts movement in a way that few modernist buildings do. Saarinen came down and personally laid the first courses of brick to show the masons exactly how he wanted it to happen, because Saarinen himself was a skilled mason. If those of you who know about Cranbrook and know about Vitrask, which came before it, and the Vesalius and Lundgren Saarinen firm in Helsinki, know that the making of things was as important as the thing itself. And this building is particularly remarkable because I've been living with it for nearly 50 years. I have yet to find a moment in which symmetry is employed as a design technique, and yet from every angle it is one of the most harmonious buildings and balanced buildings I know. And he was able to achieve this without ever resorting to symmetry. So everything is balanced by the way things are arranged. Note the side aisle there down low on the left as a way of balancing that very large sanctuary and the bell tower to the right. Look at this composition of the campanile and the bell tower and go around the back of the building and you find the chapel and the boiler stack, repeating that theme and that relationship in miniature. So you have a composition on the front and a composition in miniature on the back. If you've been up to Cranbrook or studied it, you would recognize all of these details straight out of the period of the Science Center, which is roughly about in development at the same time. And you would also begin to see Eero's interest in sculpture. That's what he started out to be. Eero was not going to be an architect, he was going to be a sculptor. So you begin to see these, that's not a holy water fountain on to the left of the door. It's simply a sculptural element put into the composition. There is no tradition of holy water in the Baptist church. People sometimes think that is, though, on the way in. This is the stairwell on the Franklin Street side, and again, it's just a refinement of many of the ideas you would see being developed in Cranbrook at the time, but it also even traces back to that living room at Vitrask, the Saarinen home in Helsinki, where the particular wrapping of the stair down into the main space really creates the mood of the entire room. Take a look just for a second at, if you can see it all the way at the top of the screen, at that wonderful oval egg-shaped lamp pointing up, because you'll see it again in a few slides and a few other projects. That's a classic Cranbrook lamp. I was thinking about ways to illustrate what I meant by the use of asymmetry, but the ability to create harmony. This is, again, a detail of the front of the church, and then the flagstone path. Every moment in this building is designed as a total composition, but every moment is unique. Charles Eames was a very young man working on this project. He designed the furniture, the pews for the project. And he designed this organ screen, which is a very complicated and wonderful screen for the organ that is made out of slats of wood in a very Scandinavian way, but for 1939 to 41, a very contemporary and radical way. And I like this detail too. This is the pulpit, just that sinuous curve slicing through there, balancing the space of the building as a whole. The Saarinen family as a whole, every member of the family was a member of the Cranbrook community and a member of the artist colony up there. Wodja Saarinen was a textile artist, and she wove a major tapestry that hangs to this day in the sanctuary called the Sermon on the Mount. And here it's a little more evident that this is the 30s from a stylistic point of view. Over time, the building has changed. This is a side view of the sunken terrace, which originally had a reflecting pool in it, but that's been filled in and there's a lawn now there. But notice the bridge of classrooms, which are actually at ground level on either end, but Saarinen manipulates the land by lowering the space between in order to create this flow of space underneath the classroom. Functionally, it also created an enclosed space for kids to run around and for outdoor activity. But originally, it had this reflecting pool in it, which was filled in long before I came along, so I never saw it. The stories are that it was filled in because a child fell in it and drowned, but I've done a lot of historical research and I can find no record of that. The other story, which is more believable, is it was filled in because it was expensive to maintain and the church didn't want to do it anymore. The other three buildings in Columbus were designed by Eero Saarinen and are really reflective of his relationship with my father. So let me switch a little bit and talk about the two of them before I go into the buildings they built together. In total, they did four. The only one that's different from the opening slide is the upper left-hand corner, which was actually the first building that Eero and Irwin did together. It's a summer home in Ontario, done in 1952. And if any of you are familiar with the GM Technical Center in Michigan, which is a rigidly Miesian composition and corporate campus from that time, it's almost unbelievable that this completely irregular, non-modular, organic piece of architecture was being done in the basement of the same office that the GM building was being done at exactly the same time. And that's actually emblematic of Eero Saarinen's career. He had a whole Miesian side to him that was rational and orthogonal and linear, and he had this more organic side to him that would ultimately lead to things like the TWA building. And as far as I can tell in my research, this cottage and the GM building together are really the first time he is simultaneously in different projects exploring those two tangents of his work. But my father, as Joe mentioned, ran for most of his career the Cummins Engine Company, taking it from a bankrupt organization with about 70 employees when he took it over in 1934 to a Fortune 500 company with a little over $1 billion in revenue when he retired in 1977. He was also the chairman of Irwin Union Bank, a bank founded by my great-great-grandfather in 1871, and which will figure in the architecture here. He did not dedicate his professional career to that, however. After about 1948, he brought in professional banking management and remained the chairman and major shareholder of that institution. He was also on the board of a number of other major corporations in the U.S., AT&T, Chemical Bank, Equitable Life, and had a number of philanthropic commitments. He was a trustee at Yale. He was on the Mayo Clinic board and on the Ford Foundation board. Also important to the story, a little bit later, he was the first layman who was president of the National Council of Churches in the 1960s, at a time when the civil rights movement was at its peak. In fact, he was one of the people who organized the March on Washington in 1963, which is what led Martin Luther King to call him the most progressive businessman in America. And that role in national church life and in the issues of the day was a very important one to him, but I also think it speaks to the importance he personally put on religion and church life. And of course, as has been mentioned, he created the architecture program. Certainly in architecture circles, that's what he's best known for. What is not as well known is that when he had the idea of putting together lists of architects and letting the local public entity choose among them, it became very apparent, perhaps from his own experience with Eero Saarinen earlier, that if they put the leading architects of the day on that list, the leading architects of the day would decline to be interviewed, because this was a very small town, 40 miles south of Indianapolis, and this was 1954, so it would be 2 days to get there from New York, or even longer from Los Angeles or whatever. So they decided, or he decided, to call his friend Eero and say, how can I make this work? And it was Eero Saarinen and he who worked out the idea of coming up with the most promising young architects for whom the opportunity to build a school would be well worth the travel. And Eero Pietro Belluschi was dean at MIT at the time, and at one of the architectural critics that Dad knew, were the ones who formulated the first lists in the early days. And as a result, it's not completely by accident that many of the early architects who were part of the architecture program in Columbus at some point worked in Eero Saarinen's firm. In a lot of ways, I've written this essay for an Eero Saarinen catalog that's got a major exhibition that's coming up soon, in which I talk about the relationship with my father. And in doing that research, it struck me that in many ways they lived a form of parallel life. First of all, you got to think about the 1950s. This was right after World War II. There was a sense, this was well before Vietnam or the sense of the limits on American potential and capability. It was the middle of the American century, and there was a kind of optimism that hard work and finding new models could really solve social problems. That was inherent and affected both Saarinen's approach to architecture and my father's approach to just about everything. And so it was an era in which much more so than today, the potential or the possibilities seemed very large. Both of them were products of very powerful ancestors. Eero was growing up with this world-famous architect as a father and trying to figure out how to make his own mark. My father's uncle, Will Irwin, was one of the leading bankers and venture capitalists in the Midwest. And in a very real sense, it's hard to think of it now because Dad became well known in his own right. But back in this time, he was the one who had the powerful father figure from a previous generation. It's remarkable in both their writings to me that they very consciously took an approach that was not grounded in a specific religion or proselytizing per se, but was grounded in a very clear moral framework. Here's a quote from Saarinen. "The external form of my work varies greatly, but inside the solution of every problem, there are underlying principles that hold it together and join each building I have done to every other one. In fact, if it doesn't sound too pompous, I would say that the common denominator of all my work is the constant philosophy, the constant respect for the principles in which I believe." And my father was well known for taking stands that were not popular in the business world based on his own principles. In the middle of the 1930s, he voluntarily unionized his own shop at a time when Ford and others were hiring National Guard-like troops to come in and break union efforts in their shops. This was something that made him extremely unpopular in the local business community in Columbus. His involvement with the civil rights movement in the '63 was another principle-based moment. And in the 1970s, a couple years before the international boycott on South Africa, Cummins was offered the opportunity to do a major factory and expand its offices, and he said to the South African government, "I'd be happy to do that, but not under the rules of apartheid, only if you will allow me to have a racially integrated operation. When they said no, he closed the office and pulled out of the country, abandoning a 20% share of the South African market for diesel engines. So both of them had this sense that principles were really an important thing. It's also very clear that they had this shared instinct to view design as a process that was a search for the best possible solution to a particular problem. They loved starting, both of them loved starting with any problem with a clean sheet of paper, and searching for a new model, a little bit cocky in one sense, because they were not, both of them would love for their models to be imitated by others and become national models. But Dad used to say quite frequently, mediocrity is expensive, and that it's actually an economical thing to go for the best. They both had what I call a balance of self-confidence and humility. The self-confidence was pretty clear, but Eero Saarinen was really well known for second-guessing his own designs mercilessly, even after construction. And in a sense, the flip side of this relentless search for better solutions, sometimes when you were a client, was your schedule and your budget were not high priorities for Eero, and this lost him several commissions over his career. And similarly, I once had a conversation with Dad saying, well, you know, you've had this incredible long career, you've created a Fortune 500 company essentially from scratch. You must feel pretty good about that. And he said, all I can remember are the failures. At every step along the way, I didn't aim high enough. And it's not that he was beating himself up too much, but to me, it was this issue of he kept it in perspective and in balance. And the other thing that I did not know Eero Saarinen personally, but those who did and I've spoken to talk often about his sense of humor. My sisters remember him bringing the model for North Christian Church into our living room and having it under a cloth, and he was much more interested in what they thought of it than what my parents did. And he brought them all around and he explained some things, and just before he lifted off the cover, he looked at them and said, now don't laugh. And then he whipped it off. This is a chart of the buildings in projects going on within a given year in Eero Saarinen's studio from right after World War II through to his death in 1961. And this is a chart of when he was working for my father. And the obvious point here is that from '49 until his death, there really wasn't a moment when the two of them weren't working together on some project. So turning to the first of the three he built with Dad, this was the Irwin, at that time the company was called Irwin Union Trust Company in the very early 50s. The building that preceded this was right across the street and was a classic limestone-fronted building projecting an image of power and wealth and security that you would expect in a bank, and my father hated it. He wanted a completely radical departure from it. He thought it was stuffy, it was unfriendly, it was, when you walked in there, you were, if you were a person off the shop floor in his factory, you would be intimidated by it. And he said, Daryl, I want something completely different. And right across the street was a site that was 1/4 of a block through which a railway spur had gone, which you can sort of see at the back. And as a result, there was also a triangular wedge-shaped part of the site at the back. And it was surrounded by these Victorian buildings from the late 19th century. And I start with the site because Saarinen always said, I see architecture not as the building alone, but the building in relations to its surrounding, whether nature or man-made. And he really learned this from his father. Another quote, every object, large or small, has a relationship to its neighbors. Perhaps the most important thing I learned from my father was that in any design problem, one should seek the solution in terms of the next larger thing. If the problem is an ashtray, then the way it relates to the table will influence its design. If the problem is a chair, then its solution must be found in the way it relates to the room cube. If it is a building, the townscape will affect the solution. So the question was, how do you put a radical departure from the traditional bank into this context? Well, first thing he did was square up the site so that it lined up with the traditional grid of the community and no longer reflected that old rail spur going through the back. So he organized a glass pavilion with all of the sort of front office pieces out front, and then where the rail spur went through, he squared it off with a big long wall here and put the back office stuff behind it. And then this long wall became a blank for the pavilion he would create that reflected a long blank wall on this side. So he created a kind of stage set backdrop for this pavilion that he then put out. And very importantly, the mitigating factor was he surrounded it with trees, and that was a very key component of the original idea. I'm going to talk in a minute about how he reinvented the teller line. I think, at least as far as I've been able to tell, that's one of the earliest instances of a drive-up window. So they were thinking about all sorts of things in new ways. And the president's office was put, at my father's insistence, in the middle of the lobby. And that was also part of his notion of the bank is there to serve the customer, and I'm going to put the president's office dead center in the middle of the lobby. So this is an early concept sketch from Saarinen showing the idea that first dominated was these trees as a way of mitigating the new contemporary architecture in context. Over time, however, the design evolved to be one of an almost pure Miesian glass pavilion, but with very un-Miesian domes on top as a way of softening and lifting the ceiling from the interior. And there it is in its context with those two big blank walls behind it, setting off the little jewel box of a pavilion in front of it. And here it is from the street, also in the 50s. Now, as you walked up to it, the whole idea here was, from his point of view, was openness and transparency, obviously. And this is how one walks in. But there are a couple things to note here. One is, this is all Mies, but that light fixture and that dome is all Cranbrook. So it's this kind of blending of his crafts tradition with this, the whole notion of the machine age. Also note that there's a brick on the floor here. That was my father's request. He specifically wanted a lobby that a person from his factory floor with oil on his boots would walk into comfortably and not be worried about messing up a carpet. The banking lobby is completely open, and so this picture from the 50s, the idea was if you needed a loan, wanted to open an account, there'd be somebody right there to sit down with you and do the business right away. This is a stairway straight out of the GM Tech Center, that kind of refined floating stair in the middle. The organizational lobby, that is the president's office, by the way, right behind that element, and the door was over here. And downstairs, they put the safety deposit vault and the boardroom. The boardroom also doubled as a community room, so it was open for use by community groups. And here's that stairway from the lower level with the vault behind. One of the things Dad disliked most about banks was this experience of going into a teller line and hitting these cages. And that and he particularly disliked when one of the tellers wasn't open, they put up a sign that said closed. So he said to Eero, I want something friendly and open, and when a teller window is not there to be used, I want it to go away, not still be there and have a big close sign on it. And so here's what Saarinen came up with. Above the about waist height, it's completely open. There are a series of fiberglass hoods here, and when somebody's available to serve you, photo would be better with a person behind it, you lift the hood out and it creates the teller window. But when the person's not, that is also a teller window. You just put the fiberglass hood in and it forms a continuous band and there's no closed sign. So it was an elegant solution, and frankly it's one that, as we've expanded the bank over the years in many different styles and forms, we've replicated. And I threw this picture in just to remind us all of how radical this building was at the time, because if you look at it, it doesn't have at least to my eye, it doesn't have a really particular grounding in a moment in time. But I love this lady, because that is 1955. And this is the grand opening of the lobby. Okay, moving on to the house that Saarinen designed for my parents in Columbus. The program here was, in no small part, driven by the fact that Columbus was a town without good hotels or restaurants, and my father was trying to build an international company. So this house had to do some double duty as a corporate entertainment and place. But at the same time, he wanted it as a good place to raise a family. This is my parents in 1947. And I put this up here partly because Dad's sitting in a womb chair that Saarinen designed, but also because to introduce my mother into the conversation, who was a very important part of the design of the house. And remind you of their previous experience with Eero was this very irregular, very organic, I call this a barefoot house. It's a place where it's a cottage only used in the summertime. Most of the rooms open up onto the outdoors without internal circulation. And they wanted something completely different from this. The site is at the north end of town. This is the main street of Columbus called Washington that runs northwest. This is an existing residential area from the 30s. This was a tobacco farm that ran, that was above the floodplain up here, and then had about a 50-foot drop down to a floodplain, which still floods, and then into the woods and the river. And they explored a couple of different locations. The first idea was partially sunken in the ground up near the street in a sort of more conventional relationship to the street, but the idea was bury it somewhat underground. That idea got nixed around a variety of practical issues, including how do you get light into all the rooms. The next one was on stilts down in the right in the floodway, which I personally am glad was rejected because there are many winters I would have had to row to school. And eventually they settled on a site just at the edge of where the land dropped off, sitting right on the ground plane as the best location. It also allowed them to think about the entry to the house coming through this residential area rather than off the main street, which appealed to them. This is a plan of the house. And the first thing that most people notice is this organization of it in 9 grids. And I saw the Palladian Villa elements out here, or the drawings studying grid systems. And at the time this was published, it was called a contemporary Palladian Villa in the magazines. I verified with my father and with Kevin Roach, who was the senior associate in the firm on this. Those were not conscious precedents. There was a very conscious precedent, but it wasn't Palladio. I'll get to that in a second. But it is divided into 9, a rectangle, slightly elongated north-south, divided into 9 sections by these skylights. And the skylights are then used to organize all the space. In each corner, not necessarily conforming just to the grid of the skylight, is a unit. That's the master bedroom, this is the kitchen, this is the guest area, and this is the children's area. And then the spaces between, which are open to the outside, are all very intentional and functional. This is the den for watching TV. This is all part of the living room and a conversation pit. This is the dining area, and that's the carport. So the organization is pretty straightforward. The built form, however, is really an extension of Mies van der Rohe's Barcelona Pavilion, which was the conscious precedent for this. It's the problem with the Barcelona Pavilion from the point of view of using it as a model for this is the Barcelona Pavilion's thin, and therefore light comes in from both sides. This is a deep house with a very important function, the living room, at the middle of the interior. So the solution to that was to bring this grid of skylights, which would bring natural light into the entire thing. That, of course, required a much thicker roof than is on the Barcelona Pavilion. But the points of similarity are this alternation of solid and void that you get, the use of massive pieces of stone, book-matched in many cases, as not only wall, but in effect wall decoration. These stones, as we'll see in another slide in a minute, are often set so that their ends are revealed. That carries through the house. And then there are these X columns, which were in the Barcelona pavilion in stainless steel. The idea of the skylight here was integrated into this X column, and it was extruded into something even more refined and thinner. This to me is the brilliant moment in the house. The way this column structurally is integrated into the skylights, which bring natural light in. They are also channels for the lighting at night to give the general ambient lighting in the room. And then they also are used as the fundamental organizational principle of the house. And then another little moment, there's the Barcelona pavilion reflecting pool, and here's the reflecting pool outside. So, I mean, this was clearly a source of inspiration and a precedent for it. Now, let me go back to this and just point out the wonderful thing about these skylights, which I never realized growing up, because when you're a kid, you're not conscious of this, is that, see how it runs here along a wall that's part of this open space, and therefore creates wonderful lighting for paintings and artwork hung along that wall, or it runs along this storage wall I'll show you in a minute. If it comes through a private sector, then it goes over the vanities that are in the bathroom for my three sisters, and through the playroom, but my brother's and my bedroom and the bedroom for each of the three girls, it doesn't cross. So there's a conscious organization of it, making it useful where it is, making sure it doesn't go where it shouldn't. Along the edge of the outside of the house, that skylight runs on the exterior. It plays a very important role because this soffit is so deep it creates a continuous porch 360 degrees around the house, which would make all these rooms quite dark if it weren't for the introduction of natural light on the exterior windows. And then here's a good example. This is through the den. It gives you a sense of how the space just flows from interior to exterior, and these skylights are used to organize and light the walls. And then this is stepping back. The last shot was of that den right there. This is on the other side of the living room, in the dining room, looking across the sweep of the house. And of course, with the orientation to the west and one of the largest openings on the west, you've got this sweeping light coming in the late afternoon. The skylights also allowed for some pretty dramatic lighting at night on the exterior. Collaborating with Kevin Roach and Eero Saarinen in designing this house was Alexander Gerard, and the things he's most well known for is this conversation pit, which this is one of the early instances of, actually going down a few steps in order to create a place to have after-dinner conversations mostly. And then this storage wall, which in a lot of ways was the invention of Alexander Gerard and my mother working together. It's a wonderful balanced composition, and I'll return to it in just a second. But if you go up and look at individual sections, the wallpaper on the back of that is almost tacky. It's this kind of collage of color and pattern that in the individual pieces you wouldn't necessarily think we're going to create a great whole, but when it's put together in a sophisticated way, it does. This is another view back the other way of the conversation pit and the way it relates to the rest of the living room. The bedrooms were, again, this is my parents' bedroom with the view to the west, and so this is the afternoon light, but no skylight going through it. And my sisters were each given one of these rooms. Saarinen told my parents that it was typical in Finnish households with lots of children to give each of the individual children a small bedroom and then a common play area together. And I got the chance for the first time to go to Vitrask, the Saarinen home outside Helsinki last summer, and I was really interested to see this pattern. and it wasn't all that evident, so I'm not sure whether he just sold them this as a great line or whatever, but each of my sisters got the individual small little room, and then we all played together in this playroom. The storage wall is worth just another word. It is this long wall running through not only the living room but the den. It has functional areas. This is a little bar. There's the stereo speakers. There's a TV further down, as well as the opportunity to display objects and art. And this skylight is the demarcation between the living room and the den, so it shows that this just runs continuously between them. It was, at the time, a well-known sort of, this was February of 1958, showed up on the front of House and Garden as the house itself got a fair amount of publicity. A couple of quick funny stories. These are the original chairs, Eames chairs, around the dining room table. And if you're down in that conversation pit, your eye is right about the bottom of that chair. And Eero was sitting down there with my parents one night looking at that and just chewing on his pipe and going, "That's ugly, too many legs." About 6 months later, these showed up. Whether or not they were designed exactly for this table is not something that there's a recorded, and there are earlier designs than that conversation, so I doubt it. But there's clearly some form of dialogue going on there. And my other favorite story is Balthazar Korab worked as an architect in Eero Saarinen's office and later became a well-known architectural photographer. And he tells the story that the reason he became a photographer was the fireplace in my parents' living room. He went through, according to Balthazar, 150 different designs for this fireplace. It ended up quite beautiful, but it cost Balthazar his architectural career. He gave up and became an architectural photographer instead. The other thing that this house is well known for is the Dan Kiley's design for the garden itself. If you go back to, it came later. They actually had an earlier architect that was, landscape architect who was fired. And so when Kiley came in, the house was essentially already sited and designed. And what Kiley did is he took the geometries of Saarinen's design and extended them into the landscape, including taking this undulating slope and chopping it back into a orthogonal plane organized around the geometries of the house. And then he extended it, that whole concept of creating rooms with landscape elements out into the yard and the garden. He surrounded the whole thing with a large hedge that gives it privacy. He responded to my father's love of alleys, which he learned about when he was traveling as a college student in the 30s in Europe. And in a real sense, to me, above the floodplain, this is Kiley doing Le Nôtre. And below the floodplain, it's Kiley doing Olmsted. You have a very large open meadow, and the woods were left largely as a natural area, the way Olmsted would in, say, the Ramble in Central Park. This is that slope on, where he scraped the land and made it into a flat sloping thing, and the alley of honey locust trees that he put at the front of it. Interestingly enough, this is an alley that runs along the side of the house, not directly up to it. It's very effective, but it was a very different approach. There's the approach through the landscape of the driveway. And Kiley was the one who also came up with the idea for this screen that would separate the arrival point, the front door is right here, from the service yard behind it, because the kitchen door is right there. And I threw in this last image because as it's grown up over the years, this garden has become a kind of all-encompassing green womb for this house at its center. And Kiley was really quite proud of this. This is a postcard from the Yale Archives from September of 1957, in which Dan just sent a little message to Eero, I guess, saying we did well. The last project that Eero and my father did together was the North Christian Church. A congregation had split off from First Christian downtown. It was all caught up in the ecumenical movement, and my father was viewed as part of the liberals, and the mother church remained conservative, and there was a kind of philosophical split, and a new church was started on the north side of town, and when they came to build in the late 50s, they hired Eero. This is a great example of Eero Saarinen's unwillingness to settle on what he didn't think was the best solution. This version of North Christian Church with these TWA building style things at the end and a kind of a Victorian railway treatment of the spire and a much larger cross was fully accepted by the congregation. That's great, let's go. And they had waited a long time. Saarinen hadn't been able to accept the commission initially, but in the end he did, but they had to wait a year for him to get started, and they were very impatient. And it was at that point that he said, this is not the best church building I can design, and he asked for more time and money to do better. And that's exactly the kind of argument that would appeal to my father. He was chairman of the building committee, so in the end he persuaded his fellow church members to do it. And the resulting church, frankly, is a lot better. I'm going to take you quickly through this because this is one building that Saarinen actually wrote his own intentions for. And so it's sort of interesting to take what he wrote and then sort of step through it. The flat site in a residential district at the northern entrance to the community led him to conclude that the church must be elevated so that it stands proudly above the parked cars and the surrounding little ranch-type houses and can be seen. He was bothered by the prominence in contemporary church design given to secondary functions, such as Sunday school rooms and good fellowship rooms and kitchens and gymnasiums and square dancing rooms. I'm not sure why I mentioned that one, but I liked it. So here you have all those functions that big and the little bitty sanctuary over there, and he didn't like that. So he wished to restore the primacy of the sanctuary seen in the cathedrals of the 11th and 12th centuries. So in this church, I would like to put all that activity downstairs, maybe underground, hidden away, and put only the sanctuary above ground and make it the significant visual and architectural thing. Considering the form of the church, Saarinen concentrated on how the primary symbol of Christian buildings, the tower or spire, had been handled historically. He concluded there was a new opportunity to make the church really all one form, all the tower. There would be a gradual building up of the sheltering, hovering planes, growing up organically into the spire. It would be good as an exterior form because the spire is a marvelous symbol of reaching upward to God, and because it would proclaim this as a church in the silhouette of Columbus. It would also work well as an interior space. It would give the feeling of soaring space and a feeling of special enclosure. It would work well for the light. The primary light source would be an oculus in the spire. It would give intense light on the communion table. This light would lead you in as you saw it from the narthex. It would also keep you from being distracted by the people across from you, but you would be aware of them. And this spire form would work well structurally. The structure could be very simple and could clearly and logically express the form and the character of the church. Now, in the late 50s and early 60s, there was an interest in the art world in abstract art and abstract expressionism, and I think it's tied into what Saarinen was doing here in terms of the way he handled the symbolism of the design. In plan, the design is a hexagon symbolically linking the church to the Star of David. This was a conscious choice. The Christian form of the spire is literally growing out of its roots in Judaism in this sense. The sanctuary has a bowl shape, as if the congregation is sitting in the hands of God. Saarinen interpreted the central importance of the weekly communion in the tradition of the church's denomination by placing the communion table literally at the center of the sanctuary. That table's broken down. This was Gerard's design, but is broken down into 12 small tables, each representing a disciple, and a taller Christ table at the end. The denomination's roots were in the American frontier, and it reflected in the congregation's decidedly democratic flavor. So as a result, the preacher is in a pulpit here on the same level as the congregation around him, not elevated above the congregation, and you look at the other people worshiping in the sanctuary kind of eye to eye. And then given the importance by the congregation placed on the quality of worship music, the organ pipes are also used as a primary sculptural element in the sanctuary. Now, Saarinen understood, however, that the most important element in creating the spiritual atmosphere he sought was light. The sanctuary on the whole is dark. It's more of an inward-looking space than the first Christian church his father designed. The natural light really only comes from two sources, an oculus at the center and this band of horizontal lights just under the roof. This is almost the same scheme he used at the Kresge Chapel at MIT. And he wrote, "I've always remembered one night on my travels as a student when I stayed in a mountain village in Sparta. There was bright moonlight overhead, and then there was soft, hushed secondary light around the horizon. That sort of bilateral lighting seemed best to achieve this otherworldly sense," and he used it twice. Let me explain one other important sequence in the building, and this is the sequence you get from the parking lot coming up and entering into the sanctuary itself. It's a very carefully considered entry sequence based on the idea, as Saarinen put it, that religion is something you should have to work for. It should be a special thing. And he talked about being inspired by an absolutely marvelous experience at Borobudur and Angkor Wat, when you keep climbing those steep steps and all the time are being subjected by the architecture to an awareness of special and spiritual qualities. So starting in the parking lot, you first climb a set of steps up to get up to the entrance to the building. And then just over the brow of the hill, you actually go down a set of steps into the doors underneath this very large roof, which is coming crashing down on you. You can, as you come under that huge plane, it's almost impossible not to bow your head. It's really a very effective thing. And then you enter into the narthex, which Saarinen conceived of as a space where the quality of the light would change, and it would act as a decompression chamber, buffering the cares of the outside world from the spiritual concerns appropriate to the sanctuary. Now, lest you think your journey's over, you've climbed uphill and you've gotten a reprieve and been able to go back downhill, you now actually have the steepest steps in the sequence to climb to get into the sanctuary itself. And as you go up them, your eye is drawn upwards to that oculus, floating there as if it were the eye of God at the center of the ceiling. One of the more innovative features of the sanctuary design was the communion table can be removed off and the dais, which in this case is twisted 90 degrees and shoved back into this corner, fits into the end to form a stage on which weddings, funerals, and concerts can be played. So it has a kind of flexibility in the use of the building itself. So that's a quick run through the various buildings that the Saarinens have done in Columbus. And let me just end with a quote from my father that he wrote for the preface of a book on Kevin Roach. "Great architecture is therefore a triple achievement. It is the solving of a concrete problem, it is the free expression of the architect himself, and it is an inspired and intuitive expression of his client. The greatest architecture accomplishes all this with no appearance of strain or awkwardness, but rather with an evident conviction that these simultaneous goals have enriched the whole enterprise and have not simply watered it down by compromise." Thank you.